So, hi there, my name is Sven. I work for a company called Solace in the office of the CTO. I'm happy to talk to you about unified event and API management with the help of AsyncAPI today for API Days Paris. Um, as an introduction, this is kind of my background. So you see that I'm like a middle-aged middleware guy. I used to be, everything around me used to be SOAP. And that's why I'm actually like, and my journey kind of changed when so maybe expand on that. So I was working with middleware vendors that everything I touched was a SOAP service, writing to a database, reading from a database, talking to a file system, everything was SOAP. So that's all I really knew. And my world kind of expanded when I worked with developers for projects where they actually said like we need different type of APIs. The SOAP stuff is not working for us, and that's when I became interested in API management and in the world of REST APIs and other types of APIs. And for me, kind of the turning point was that it's like much more an outside-in view of the world. So what do developers really need? Maybe you need a shower gel to take a shower. You don't want SOAP, right? So that's why I'm excited to talk about this today, and also why I'm introducing myself this way is that I think in terms of event-driven, we're actually at a similar point that we were at with SOAP and service-oriented architecture, so back in the day, where we actually have like a real strong demand for these type of technologies, and the use cases kind of scream for event-driven, but it's really hard to actually do event-driven APIs. So that's really what I want to talk about today. So the agenda is essentially like 3 parts. The first thing I want to talk about is the challenge. So why do we need event-driven APIs? Which use cases drive the need for event-driven APIs, and why is it hard? Then I'll talk a bit about the solution, like integrated API management, API marketplaces, and how AsyncAPI actually helps us address this and make event-driven APIs easy to consume. And then, because I'm a skeptical person, and most probably you are as well, I'll talk you quickly through an implementation of that. So how real is it? How can you do this? So that's kind of like the outline of the presentation. So I'm going to start with this slide, and actually this slide is kind of convincing. It's got a Gartner logo on it. It's shows here the need for speed, the diminishing value of data over time. And so it's a nice slide and it looks credible, but there is actually pain behind this. And I kind of like to think about things in a more concrete way. So let's talk about the pain that users see and that developers experience when they're trying to move up into those real time and seconds kind of data processing rather than minutes or hours and something like that, right? So here's an example. This is I grabbed this from a messaging board where somebody tries to buy flooring from a DIY store, and they find it incredibly hard to actually find out who carries this flooring and where is it in stock, and any path they take kind of leads them to this item actually is not available that they're looking for. And why is that? Because the information is outdated wherever, right? Or the user journey is like at the point where they actually really check that stuff is where it's supposed to be. It's too late in the user journey, right? So it's a really bad user experience. So how do you fix this? So imagine you're the developer, you need to fix this. REST APIs, you're familiar with, but like how can you get this real-time information up to date into, say, a mobile app? That's kind of like what I'm interested, what I think event-driven APIs will help us to address. So the answer, of course, for me is you need events, right? So you actually, like when you think about that user journey, that kind of like epic odyssey that this user was on to find like a few square meters of flooring, what would help to improve that? You need to get actual stock levels. And once they ordered, the actual order status, so they can go and pick this stuff up when it's ready to collect, right? They only want relevant information to them. I'm not interested, I'm down, if I'm in Paris, I don't want to know that this article is available in Marseille, for example. And so we want to be really selective with what we get. And we want to actually combine these async APIs with synchronous APIs. So of course you need REST APIs to query product information and render it on the screen. But then you'd need event-driven APIs to actually get a real-time feed of the stock level, so people don't get that disappointment when they're trying to put something or order something that it's actually not available for them. And the other point from a developer point of view is that I want to get access to this easily, right? So it's like it needs to be like event need to be as simple as synchronous APIs, REST APIs, or what have you. So the problem with that is when you think about the messaging world, the event world, there is actually, it's quite complicated. So there's multiple messaging APIs. You need to choose which one do I choose, how do they all work. They're also like a bit harder to get than a request response type of pattern. The brokers that these events live on are usually still closely guarded by middleware guys. And there are no well-established API paradigms, really, if you think compared to REST APIs. So the sum of that is that developers face a high barrier to entry. Now let me expand on a couple of these things, right? So especially like the third point. So what do I mean with no established API paradigms? If you look at the REST world, if you get like a base path for a REST resource and you get an API key and you know you need to put the API key in an HTTP header and send it over, you actually have most of the tools you need to figure out how that API works. You can do a get on the resource on, say, on /customers, get a response back, have an idea what the payload looks like. You can try maybe adding an ID to the end, like a customer ID that you find in the response, right? So you can actually, by all, we know there's get, post, put, all of the different conventions. You actually don't necessarily, like, it always helps to have a proper API documentation, but you don't necessarily, to figure out the basics of an API, you don't necessarily need a big bunch of documentation, because the API is kind of self-documenting because we have all these well-established paradigms. If you think about event-driven APIs, that is not really the case. We have essentially like verbs, but they're more like kind of like, here's a request, here's a response. I'm publishing, I'm subscribing. But all of the semantics of URLs, the verbs on the in REST APIs like get, post, put, and so on, that's all missing. So which actually makes it really important that we have a standard like AsyncAPI to document our APIs, because they're, as I said, like not very intuitive or to use compared to REST APIs. So that's kind of like the starting point where we are. It's kind of like, it would be nice to have, there's a strong need for it, but then it's kind of hard to use event-driven APIs and expose them, make them consumable. So that's what I want to talk about in the next section, is kind of how do we address that problem and what do we need to look out for to create kind of usable event APIs that like, or something that's actually developer friendly. So the first lesson that we've learned from my experience with different customers and prospects is that typically like people want one developer portal. So you have different types of APIs, REST, GraphQL, now AsyncAPI. So they want to find everything in the same place. So you don't want to have too many options. You don't want to log in here to do this, log in somewhere else to find out about event APIs. You want to have it all in one place. And even customers who come to us and say like, we actually only want to manage event-driven APIs, inevitably they'll go, and what about these REST APIs we have as well? Because of course they all have REST APIs galore. So we see two patterns how we can address that. So we call this, like, one is kind of event native API management, or kind of unified API management sitting in front of a messaging event broker infrastructure. So that's this first pattern where essentially like the consumers, the apps the developers go to one developer portal to find out what APIs are available to them. And they may have like REST APIs and async APIs presented to them. They can subscribe to them. They can get access keys and all the good stuff that you need to connect to a REST endpoint, or now also to an event endpoint. And we see like actually like an API management capability around the events that are used within the enterprise also is quite crucial to actually model the events that we have, the event APIs, so groups of events that work together to expose a certain set of functionality, and how we and address certain use cases, more importantly. and how do we surface that into an event in an API developer portal. So that's the one pattern we see. The other pattern that we see is this universal API marketplace, where you have, of course, all which kind of addresses also the change in the landscape of API management in larger enterprises, where you essentially have, like, most probably have a legacy API management solution, cloud vendors, API management solutions, or gateways, and we see like AsyncAPI, like an AsyncAPI gateway plugging into the same type of infrastructure in an API marketplace, instead like being one part, like being an API management solution amongst many other API management solutions. And of course, what we're dealing with is opposed to AsyncAPI, so our open API, we're dealing with AsyncAPI. So that's the currency, or the way what we surface up, and also what we use to then, when a developer says, I want to have access to that, how we configure the underlying messaging infrastructure to allow for this access to exactly the resources the developer should have access to. And I'll explain that maybe a little bit more about that in a while. So with these two patterns, like from my point of view, if you need like an API, of course, in both of these patterns, you need to have an API gateway. Sometimes the API gateway is like an existing API gateway that also now talks some sort of messaging protocols. I like to think about the broker as being the gateway, because if you look at like what a message broker is, it is like an HTTP proxy or like an API proxy, but people are forced to go through it anyway. So a broker, like most of the event-driven approaches have like a broker architecture, right? Or a cluster of broker, a mesh of brokers, whatever it may be. But when you look at the functionality of a gateway, you actually see that it has things like connection policies, like an API gateway has, like security policies, IP whitelisting, blacklisting, this type of stuff. Some quality of service. They're different because the scarce resource on a broker is like queue sizes and time to live of messages, right? So kind of like it's a different type of resource rather than throttling of the requests that we're looking at here. So we have quality of service policies, but they do different things. And we're looking for client-friendly messaging protocols, right? We have those in many brokers. So you have an MQTT broker. It's quite a client-friendly and a user-friendly messaging protocol, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. Is like it's easy for developers to subscribe to exactly the information they want, because MQTT is built around fine-grained topics, right? And then there's content policies. Brokers typically don't do things like message transformation validation, so maybe that'll come later. But my point is, like an event broker is essentially kind of like, you look at it as a specialized API gateway, and this ties in with what people have been talking about recently. Is kind of like, do you need a gateway source, like a big massive API gateway that does everything, or do you have specialized API gateways that do like certain things really well, and they for certain use cases, which like an event API gateway and the broker could be, right? So that's where we're coming from here. And then to go a little bit more detail on the client-friendly messaging protocols, this really ties back to what I started with. Is kind of like, when I'm building this app and I'm using the app for my DIY store, I want to get the relevant information for that store, right? So stock levels in the store, not all the stock levels of all the stores in the whole country. I want to get like exactly the bits of data that I'm interested in. And so that means a couple of things. You need to have events on a fine-grained topic hierarchy that's similar to resource URLs. So you can actually say, this store ID, this product ID is what I'm currently interested in, or these 5 store IDs because they're in the vicinity of the user, plus this product. So I can actually present options to the user, right? And the API client needs to be able to apply these filters. So on the fly, when a user says, I want, like, this is where I am, or like this, show me what's in stock close to me, the API client needs to be able to apply these filters. And that leads you towards messaging protocols like MQTT, or using REST as an interface to an event broker, or using webhooks if you need to send events somewhere, or to proprietary formats like the Solace messaging format, which is pretty similar to MQTT. And to add some more detail on that is, as an example, is exactly this stock levels. If you think like this is also where AsyncAPI helps us, because we can express these complex or these fine-grained resources, right? So it helps a lot to have, like, instead of having product stock level, you subscribe to it, you get everything you want. You need to have, it helps a lot if you have fine-grained access. You can actually maybe specify the region, the product ID, so that maybe the UK or France, the product ID, the store you're interested in. And from a management perspective, you most probably want to do something like, when I register my application, I set the region to be UK, because that's the app that I'm producing is the one for the UK. And then at runtime, I set product ID and store dynamically, right? And that's something that is really super easy to express in AsyncAPI, what you can see on the left-hand side. So that's kind of like how we think how this challenge can be addressed, and how event APIs can get to every developer. For me, like, just to recap, is important is also the protocol you expose. So it is REST-like, because we like, if you think about what REST, for instance, as a standard, gives people is control over exactly the data they need to obtain at the right time. So by customer ID, order history by customer ID, all this kind of stuff, right? And on the other hand, user-friendly also means like it's a simple to use messaging protocol that, on the other hand, is also simple to expose, so it doesn't give you a lot of security. It doesn't provide a big attack surface for security purposes. So like a small dedicated broker gateway into your event driven architecture that you may have internally. So now, if we talked about the solution, I just want to talk a little bit about how this can look like. It's, of course, you could do this with, you could build it your own. There's providers that give you that provide solutions out of the box for that. I just wanted to give you a flavor, because I personally kind of like, I like to hear about all of these ideas, but I also want to put them into action. So I'm just going to walk you a little bit through what a developer experience looks like for somebody who's subscribing to async APIs, gets access to these APIs. And maybe I'll explain a little bit also about how we expose these event-driven APIs and how we utilize AsyncAPI in that context. So what we see here is essentially like a view of a developer portal. A developer comes in, they see like a list of APIs or API products that are offered to them. They actually don't know if this is event-driven or if it's a REST API. So the one that I've highlighted is actually a combination of two resources, a REST API and an event-driven API, because to address the use case we've talked about earlier, you need to have the traditional REST APIs to obtain product information, catalog information, all this kind of stuff, but you also need to get the real-time updates on availability. So when you drill down into one of those, you can actually then view the async API. So again, the async API for me is really important, because there's no way, like you see from the verbs, these are all published. This means they're all consumable by me as a client, these channels, or the operations on the channels. But I don't know, is this an update? Is it a delete? Is it what kind of CRUD operation is this event representing that I get? So hence why the rich topic namespace that we can document with AsyncAPI becomes really important. And then, as you would expect, like to connect to one of those APIs, you need to have information like the server. So you can actually quickly subscribe to this API and get the server information, your credentials, and get your events into some sort of testing tool, just to see that you get the right stuff that you're looking for. So next step is to actually create an application and then create credentials. So you need a username and a password, and you need to get access to exactly one, or like in this case, to exactly one API product. And here you get all the information you need to connect, right? So and also information about the permissions that are actually like that your AsyncAPI provides on a broker. What can you subscribe to? what values can you use in different parts of the URL that are actually URL or kind of, I don't know, the channel parameters, not URL parameters, the channel parameters in AsyncAPI. So you can explore all of that. And now you essentially, like within a couple of minutes, you have enough information to go into Postman or some other testing tool, create an MQTT connection, punch in your username, password that you've obtained, punch in your URL, create a subscription with one of the channel definitions that you are based on one of the channel definitions you grab from your AsyncAPI, and you're ready to go. You get your events coming in real time. You see your stock levels coming in, and as a developer, you now know how to connect, have everything you need to connect your app, and you have an understanding of what of the events that are going to come in. All right, and again, like, why do we need that? Especially for async APIs, is like it is not a self-documenting as a REST API with like would be with Apidays or some other mechanism, HAL or something like that, to present links to other resources and stuff like that, right? So that's the developer experience. And then how do you actually get this stuff into developer portal? I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we utilize async APIs for that. So we essentially have like a life cycle where we can import async APIs. So increasingly vendors are actually, like SAP, for example, they have an API portal where they expose their async APIs. But as we all know, SAP APIs are hard to understand. So you need to document them better. You maybe need to package events from multiple APIs into a new API. So that's where we come in, where we import async APIs or events from existing infrastructure. We compose event APIs, so we actually pick from a pool of events to say these are the resources or the events we want to expose within this API. And because, once again, because a broker sits in the middle, we're essentially just kind of documenting what is available on that broker rather than building an API proxy or something like that, as you would do on an API gateway. So we compose these event APIs, we package them up, tie them to maybe to protocols, give them policies like how many, what's your spool size, how long will your messages be kept for you, and then that is actually being pushed up into the developer portal. And on the other hand, we get requests from the developer portal back to let us know people want to use that API, and that's where Async API comes into play again, because we can use Async API to generate all of the access control that we have. We know all the access control we need to impose on the gateway. So we can derive all the fine-grained permissions, which topics they can publish to, which topics they can subscribe to, which values they can use in channel parameters. We can, all of that can be derived from the Async API, and that becomes essentially now configuration on a gateway broker. So the app that the developers registered, all of the information you've got on there can be used to connect the app to the the gateway broker. So a couple of screens of how that look like. It's essentially you have your different events. You can see this event is actually reused in multiple different contexts, in different event APIs. You have, in this case, unbounded variables. So this is very much aligned with Async API. Again, Async API helped us to define how all of this needs to work. And it also, anything you see on these screens can be exported to Async APIs automatically. So in an integrated way into developer portal, people could just download it from here. Then once you actually create these event APIs, you can actually see, like, an event API would utilize a pool of events. So you can see the stock level updates in here. And again, the last bit is we actually package these up as products. This is where we take our interface definition, like an abstract async API that hasn't got information about servers or protocol-specific bindings, to a place that we can actually describe a physical location for that and a physical representation of that API, where we can have multiple plans on it. For example, different service levels, maybe a free plan that doesn't allow you to consume guaranteed messages, another plan that allows you to consume guaranteed messages, but only gives you a tiny little bit of spool space on a broker. And you can see we also kind of suggest at this stage which protocols should be used for that API. So that's kind of like the back office and functionality that kind of powers the developer experience that I showed early on. So this bit, what we see here, is what we saw on the developer portal early on. So to wrap this all up, I kind of talked you through the challenge, what we see the need for event-driven APIs, and also the challenge that they're really like, it's a clunky technology that we may need to make easily consumable, so we can drive adoption of that technology. It's the right solution to many problems. It just needs to be an easy solution as well, so people can utilize it. We saw kind of a solution, different patterns. Is it like a unified kind of integrated API management solution where the API management solution completely kind of fronts the event-driven APIs, or is it a solution where an event-driven API management capability plugs into an API marketplace that aggregates APIs from different gateways and different API management platforms? And we saw also the importance of like choosing the right protocol, choosing a protocol that doesn't kind of require you to open up your network topology to the outside world, for example. So these are some considerations more general around that. Kind of MQTT seems like a good idea. SMF from Solace seems like a good idea. Others not so much, maybe. So those are the kind of points I made there. And then we got a brief glimpse of how we actually do that, just as an example of like, this is actually real and people can do this type of stuff. So thanks for your attention today. And I hope to hear from you. If you've got any questions, get in touch. And just to wrap it up, it was essentially going back from this, from the original version of this meme here. I want access to events. Now you have access to the events straight away in the right format, exactly the events you want, instead of having to go through a long cycle of finding with the middleware team. It needs to be as simple, and it now is as simple as connecting to a REST API.